r/explainlikeimfive. Troy Soina says, explain like I'm 5 are the 100+ year old skyscrapers still safe? I was just reminded that the Empire State Building is pushing 100 and I know there are buildings even older. Do they do enough maintenance that we're not worried about them collapsing just due to age? Are we going to unfortunately see buildings from that era get demolished soon? Fokalak says, 100 years is not old where a building is concerned, so long as they are maintained, of course. We have buildings that predate the Norman conquest and that is far from unusual in Europe. Majekarith says, it's not the 100-year-old skyscrapers you should be worried about, it's the 50-year-old ones. Enceladus89 says, I trust the build quality of the older buildings more than newer ones. Modern construction cuts a lot of corners to save money, and waterproofing is notoriously worse in modern buildings. Pepperoni Dogfoot says, short answer, yes. Long answer, every commercial building is required to have a regular inspection by a qualified city inspector. This is how they get their certificate of occupancy. It may be yearly or every other year, but it happens on a schedule. They inspect above ground structure, foundation, plumbing, HVAC, electrical, safety systems, etc. etc. If there are failures, the building owners have a certain amount of time to fix it, or they lose their coup and they cannot conduct business legally. r/explainlikeimfive. Theric says, explain like I'm 5 does process to turn milk into yogurt change the nutritional facts? Other than spoiling later than regular milk and the beneficial bacteria, there are no other benefits of eating yogurt vs just drinking all the milk, right? It doesn't add protein or anything like that. I guess the bacteria involved eat the sugars in the milk, so yogurt would have less carbs than the original milk. I've been trying to incorporate more protein in my diet. I've thought about making my own yogurt, but IDK if it's ultimately worth it, nutrition wise. And my hill says, I cannot tolerate drinking milk, but can yogurt, so for me, yogurt is better nutritionally, because I will consume it, and it's healthier than ice cream etc. I make my own Greek yogurt from whole milk. It's a process I enjoy, and I have full control of what goes in it. I use homemade vanilla extract with a blonde drum base that is particularly amazing when adding berries to the yogurt when served. I use a gallon of milk at a time and it lasts me a week or two. I don't add anything other than vanilla to the making process, so each bowl is fully customizable. Chip Salt says, proper Greek yogurt is also mostly lactose free. The bacteria eats milk sugars, lactose, and turns the product sour, so lactose intolerant people can eat it even when made from regular milk. Point of fact, most Caucasian adults are lactose intolerant to some small degree. You may not even notice it, or just tolerate it, until you stop consuming it. Usually after stopping you'll feel much lighter and less bloated than normal. Diaveritity says, yes, it changes the nutrition facts. Compare the nutrition label of milk vs yogurt. Whole milk, 3.5%. For an 8 FLOS serving, is 8 grams of protein and 150 calories. Meaning 32 over 150 calories, 21%, are protein. Now look at some of the oldie Greek yogurts that are 100 calories with 12 g of protein where 4800ths, 48% of calories are from protein for a 5.5 oz serving. A lot of water and fat get removed in the process of making yogurt. As a vegetarian, Greek yogurt is one of the best protein sources on a calorie basis for me. Eggs, tofu, and protein powders are also top 5 contenders. r/explainlikeimfive. Dramatic Broccoli 614 says, explain like I'm 5, what is passing in pole vaulting? I'm watching the Olympics and hear a lot of cases of pole vaulters passing a jump and then moving to the next highest. Do you get an infinite number of passes? I've seen a couple fail on one jump twice and then pass it before they probably fail for the third time and are eliminated. If this is the case, then why do pole vaulters even bother attempting the first heights? Dark Legion 412 says, only your highest cleared mark counts. There is no requirement to clear lower heights. At any point you can pass a height, even after you failed an attempt. Once you have failed clearing any height 3 times in a row, you are out. It's beneficial to some to pass on lower heights to save energy if they are confident they can make a higher height. Tunicle says, when I was in high school, a neighboring school had a pretty elite pole vaulter. At state one year he passed on every height until everybody else scratched. He scratches his first 3 attempts and lost when he could have easily won by not passing. Juaish says, you get 3 attempts at each height. But in reality, you only are allowed 3 misses in a row. Let me explain. Before the meet starts, officials determine what height the bar will start at and what increments it will go up by. You can decide to start at any height from the opening one to any of the increments later. If you are capable of jumping far above opening height, you would pass on the first height, or many of the first heights, to not waste time and energy on those jumps. Everyone is given an opportunity to take 3 attempts at each height until they miss all 3. Once you open and clear a height, you can always skip subsequent heights, again to not waste energy. Now here's where it gets complicated. If you miss a height, you can forego your next attempt at that height and pass to a higher height. But you only get 2 attempts at that new height, since you already used 1. Effectively, if you miss 3 times in a row at any height, you're out. This is why Sam Kendrick missed at 5.85 and passed to 5.90. There was no point for him to jump at 5.85 and make it, since it wouldn't get him a medal and would waste a jump for him. Most vaulters have about 9 good jumps in them on a given day. Once they get too tired, they get slower. And once you're slower, it's potentially quite dangerous to jump, since you might not make it safely into the pit. r/explainlikeimfive. CryptGood says, explain like I'm 5. What differentiates us states from us territories? I know that us states govern themselves with a federal overhead, and everyone in a state is considered a citizen. What about us territories? How is that different from states? What permissions or rights do they have or not have compared to us state? Thanks in advance. Tomalatus says, territories don't get representation in the federal government, but are still subject to the laws of the federal government. They don't have to pay federal taxes, and they don't get to vote in any US elections. They do have local elections, but they are still subject to federal laws. The people do have a citizenship, and they do get the right to vote if they move to a state and then must pay federal taxes, but anyone who moves to a US territory loses their right to vote, even through absentee ballot, and are no longer subject to federal taxes. US territories are the only place in the universe a US citizen can't vote, because any citizen living overseas or even astronauts in space can vote via absentee ballot. Flying Circus Dog says, the biggest practical difference is that territories do not send representatives to Congress. They will send people to speak on behalf of the territory, but they don't have a vote when it comes to passing laws. Brambletail says, there are different kinds of territories, but in general you should think of territories as land held by the US that does not meet the requirements for or has not assented to statehood. Typically, the inhabitants are US citizens, although not always. Samoans are US nationals. Silly Pineapple 3554 says, the territories are controlled by the federal government, although in practice most of them have their own local government that runs things to the extent Congress has allowed them to. Because they don't have shared sovereignty like states do, there is no issue of law that only the territorial government and not Congress can decide things on, while with applying law to the states, Congress is limited in its power over many subjects. They territories are not entitled to representation in Congress, though the House has admitted non-voting delegates, and don't have electors for president in the Electoral College. For some purposes they aren't considered part of the United States. For instance, different income tax laws apply, and until Congress passed laws to grant it, people born there didn't necessarily have US citizenship. r/explainlikeimfive. New England Synthorch says, explain like I'm 5. Why do even the best radio stations play the same songs over and over? I love rock music, and I usually have my car's radio dial turned to my local rock station. However, I've noticed that they always play the same songs over and over, with some new material thrown in for good measure. The only exceptions to this are when they have special blocks dedicated to playing songs they don't usually have in regular rotation, such as playing 3 hair metal songs in a row, or playing a deep cut off of an actual record. I mean, there are tons of great rock artists out there that had plenty of hits, so I don't get why the station's selection is so limited. Drums24 says, something like 99.99% of radio stations are owned by one of 2 companies. And a huge number of them are now just playlists run by a computer. And I'd bet money the same handful of playlists are used by all radio stations owned by the same company. Skittlebog says, because it is owned by a conglomerate that dictates what will be played and when. They also run the same playlist for days in a row, just starting at a different time. Intet42 says, sounds like you want an indie station, like KDHX. I'm not sure I've ever heard them repeat a song. You can listen online. Mitchell Steam says, radio stations play the same songs repeatedly because their primary goal is to keep listeners tuned in for as long as possible to sell advertising time. Most listeners only tune in for short periods, like during a commute, and they want to hear familiar songs they enjoy. By playing popular hits repeatedly, stations increase the chances that listeners will hear something they like, making them more likely to stay tuned. Additionally, many radio stations are owned by large corporations that control playlists at a national level, limiting regional variation. Research and audience surveys also play a role, as stations often rely on data to determine which songs are most popular and will keep listeners engaged. Introducing new or less familiar songs carries a risk of losing listeners, so stations tend to stick to a formula that works financially. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.